Good afternoon, everybody. It's so good to see you. Welcome to the Winter Park Library, to our Past Meets Presents series on history, which we've been doing since, well, really since 2017, but in an ongoing way since we came back from COVID. My name is Dr. Carl Kriesman. I am a professor of history at Valencia College and currently serving as the Dean for History, the Assistant Dean for History, and I'm centered right across the street at the Winter Park campus of Valencia College. We'd love to have you come visit us sometime. It's a great pleasure to work and partner with the library. We actually have two different series, but this year we've combined them in honor of celebrating our semiquincentennial and enjoying the whole process. We're kind of working our way through a variety of topics. Some of them are dated. So when we get to July, we will be actually, I want to enlist all of you. We're actually going to read the Declaration start to finish and kind of take a moment. I'm going to have a microphone. We're going to pass it around. I'm going to have it printed out for you. It'll be on up there on the wall. We're going to talk, we're going to listen, we're going to read, we're going to think about it a little bit in the process. In August, Professor Sama will be here and we will examine the August campaign of General Washington and the Army as they fought and lost in New York, repeatedly lost. And then we also have more thematic things. So next month we're going to be looking at women in the Revolution with Dr. Bryson. Later, Professor Sama will come back and we will be looking at slavery in the Revolution. Some of you, if you looked at the list of activities back in January, knew that this was supposed to be a day when we were looking at literature in the Revolution, but Professor Borglum had an event that came up and conflicted. He's one of our leaders of our students at Valencia who go and do quiz bowl things, data testing stuff, and they're always in the national running, and they're up in, I think, Chicago right now, competing for a national award. So that means what we're doing today, we should have probably done either in January or in December. We didn't do it in January because, back to dating, we looked at Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which was released in January of '76, and we kind of talked our way through that. So in one sense, this kind of precedes some of the work that we've been talking about. When Professor Borglum had to step away, I thought, okay, this will be still good. It's early enough for us to kind of take a look. And there's kind of an overarching sense of, for myself at least, as I walk through this, which is, not my first rodeo going through this material, is to just think and reflect on how major events that we then celebrate 250 years later often turn and swing on really unexpected moments, and how those things are never predetermined. It's sort of just that random event happened that kind of pushed a trigger over. And maybe the other thing I like to consider as I look at these revolutionary moments is just how fragile institutions and organizations are. If you do any depth study on governments of the people, which we are a type of, technically a republic, but there's another word that often gets bandied about in terms of there are at least two, maybe three ways of defining or structuring what we would call a government of the people. What we can see historically is those are very, very difficult to hold. So revolutions kind of move and shape, and often it is a very small group of people who push and achieve in something. It's not like the mass. In fact, one of the things we take away from looking at the American Revolution is that the masses were never on the side of the revolutionaries. There's only a few brief moments where if you were taking a public opinion poll, you would see the majority on the side of the revolution. Certainly as it went further along and you get closer to Yorktown, certainly by that point more people had kind of accepted. But even at that point, you still had a very, very healthy percentage of the country who thought this was a terrible idea, were not happy with it, and were very fearful of the future. So if we find ourselves, I would say as we find ourselves, often in similar times where it feels like the country is either at odds with itself or in a sense of disagreeing about a best possible future, take at least a little solace in the idea that this is seemingly where we've always been. And so somebody's going to be the winner, and you may not like the winning side, and then you have to decide what you do from that. That's a different conversation. So what we want to do today is we'll kind of walk our way up to 75. If we can get there, I'll do my best. We will sort of loop back into where Professor Sama had us in January to really take a little more in-depth look at Lexington and Concord. We'll do my best to try to get us there, but we'll definitely for sure get to the first Continental Congress, and that's where we will stop. And then in July, we'll take a little bit more look at some of the early events leading through the Second Continental Congress And then ultimately, like I said, we're going to read the Declaration. That's the whole plan for July, is really read it and take it. I mean, many of us have heard it a few times, but most of us have not really sat down and read it to see, like, well, what are the boys saying? And what are they really laying out here? And it's really an audacious argument, but we'll leave that right there. Just realize July of 76 is not predetermined. There's a couple of moments which I'll point out to you that almost couldn't happen. But we start there, just so you can kind of see it. 75, all these things happen. The Second Continental Congress is going. We've tried to kiss and make up with the Olive Branch Petition, but by this time, the king feels attacked. And one of the things I'm going to ask you to be doing through this whole conversation is put yourself in the minds of the neutral observer and be able to say to yourself what the Americans or the British colonists in North America, what they were thinking. But then, what were the British thinking? The people living in England, the government, the crown. And remember that there are at least 30 to 40% of the citizens in North America who are with these guys. So their viewpoint as these guys are right. In other words, think of it this way. The American Revolution is not a revolution, it's a civil war. So our official quote-unquote civil war is really the second U.S. Civil War. And so when you get that in your head, which I know is difficult because of the mythology and the way we teach it to middle schoolers and stuff like that, it's all down one simple road. The evidence does not support that in the least. So as good historians, we want to step back and try to say, okay, and as hopefully, and you may be, I hope you're with me, a patriotic American who is glad that you are here and who is willing to celebrate what this thing is and the audacious nature of what it proposed, even in our probably many ways we have failed to achieve our high ideals, nonetheless purporting those ideals and then reaching for them. I think that's got some nobility to it, right? But so if you say all that, you still as a historian have to say, all right, I don't have a skin in the game, let's just see the evidence. And as you see the evidence, what you begin to recognize again is how narrow this thing, its achievement or its accomplishment, or that there's no fait accompli. I mean, it's up for grabs right up till the end, to at least 73, which we'll see. And so when I realized that, and I realized the mythology of, hey, we were minding our own business, and this evil country came from out of nowhere and tried to take over us and apply a bunch of stupid rules, and how dare they take our liberty from us, and we nobly stood up and defended ourselves against those evil, evil British people. When you put that to bed as a falsity and say, okay, what really happened? And then you realize, oh, a whole bunch of, I'll use this term, Americans were on the side of defending their government, and their government was in London. And then there were a bunch of other Americans who felt their government was being oppressive and had reached the end of its usefulness, and that they could do something different. But their doing something different is in rejection of their government. So when you see that, for me at least, it helps me comprehend all the other moments of high tension, including, I think, the one we're living in a different way. So this all goes down, and then it led the boys ultimately in May and then June to begin the process of leading to the Declaration, which we will look at later. So how do we get there? Well, one, we have to understand, as I just got finished trying to stress, these are British citizens. There is no one, not even Sam Adams, who is making a declaration in 65 that I am an American citizen. Nobody's thinking of an American nation. Nobody's perceiving anything in what we would call national terms. So they're British citizens, meaning they're seeing themselves arguing out of a set of rules, rights, and liberties that are theirs and theirs alone as British citizens. So then we have to get the background. Now it's difficult to do. I had to cut a bunch of slides out here because there was so much I want to tell you. But in short, the 1600s for England becomes its own period of turmoil. 2 civil wars, one officially called, one not officially called, ultimately leading to a moment when the Parliament decides, you know what? We don't like this guy. We don't like the way this is going. The last of the Stuart kings. we're going to, well, technically not the last of the Stuart kings, because they're going to turn to his daughter and say, hey, how would you like to overthrow your dad? And so she's like, I'm all in. And her husband like, go for it. And that is our friendly William and Mary. But notice they accept the invitation with major limitations. Those limitations are known to us as the Bill of Rights. It's officially known as the Declaration of Rights when it's first introduced in January. Actually, it was read. William and Mary knew about this when they came. Now, there's a whole longer conversation about why would a person like William take on this role knowing he's being bound by limitations that no king on the planet would accept or had accepted to that point. In other words, the British were not copying something that was already being done. They were constructing a new idea. But he does, and ultimately when you look at these, and you can see it took him a year to finalize it, but it's really all agreed at the beginning. It's a very familiar list. And so when you then think about, which we will not do this year, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, of which I would argue only 8 of them really are about rights, and then 9 and 10 do their own separate thing. But when you look at that list of things, and you say, well, where does that come from? Oh, we just thought it up. Madison made it up. People who were angry and the Anti-Federalists made it up. No, they're looking back to their ancestry to say this is something that we had created. Now, if you take some of these and you go back to Rome and Athens, you can find the legacy. But in short order, for at least arguably 1,000 years, nobody on the planet had done anything like this. Nobody thought this was worth doing, right? So again, one of the things I hope you take away from this year is how unique and singular and perhaps weird it is what we do, what we proposed and now have tried to maintain in various efforts for 250 years. And as I said earlier, one of the things, if you do history, look at governments of the people, they're very difficult to maintain. Or another way to say it is they're extraordinarily fragile. And there's reasons. Hobbes would tell you why, but we don't have time to do that. But, you can see these and you go, oh, okay, wow. Freedom of speech, juries, right to bear arms, all these kinds of things all have their legacy in our British history. And we need to keep that in mind. And when you then read, if you do, and I urge you to, and we'll mention some of these in passing, read some of the great writings that preceded the Declaration, universally, they are reaching back to here to say to Parliament, hey, what you're doing is wrong. How do I know it's wrong? This list. That's their argument, over and over and over again. Now, obviously, Parliament doesn't agree with them for a variety of reasons, which we may see some of those. But when you read those things, we're coming back to here. Okay, so then what does that mean? Remember, the British colonies can be understood really in like 2 larger groups. But by the time you roll into the 1700s, you've got them all but Georgia. You've got the 12, right? And they're established. But from that moment, say we say 1700 or post-Glorious Revolution, there is not a flood, but a consistent movement of peoples from Europe, mostly in the British lands, so Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, all coming over, right? So when you think of this, so you have your originals, right? And by the time you get to 76, we're probably at least in 4th generation, maybe 5th generation of the originals. But the bulk of people are newer, say in a 20 to 50 year window, right? What are they coming over with? Well, they're coming over with all that. That's the world they know, right? So when they do, they begin the process of living in mimicry of what they know. No differently than if there is a colony that goes to the moon, so glad Artemis got back safely, what a wonderful 10 days of watching. If we do go to Mars, and if you go to Mars, let's have a random group of people, or like happened here, some company, Microsoft sends its own group to Mars to set up its own colony, right? Or Mercedes-Benz does. We wouldn't or shouldn't be surprised if they begin to mimic the government that they know from the earth that they left. Now, theoretically, they'll do something else as they go along, but initially, oh, look, They've got a Bill of Rights. That seems very familiar. I'm glad Mars Colony's done that. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's what these guys are doing. But keep in mind, as this is happening from the Glorious Revolution inward, England's got bigger fish to fry. Other things are going on. They're not thinking about what is the colony doing from a governance point of view. Like most of us, we sent 300 people up to Mars. We'll hope they're doing great. I assume NASA's watching. I'm not paying attention. I got stuff here. I got my things. And there's only 300 of them. And then when I'm older, I turn around and like, oh, there's 30,000? Well, I didn't know that many people had moved to Mars. What? I guess that's cool. I still don't care. We call that salutary neglect, meaning the government was neglecting, meaning they weren't paying attention, because there's just these random few people who have moved to this vast wilderness to do whatever it is they do over there. I don't know. Does that make sense? Salutary, it's not mean, it's just, yeah, good luck, go do it, have fun, right? Part of that is connected to the numbers. They just didn't perceive, because there weren't a lot of people living over there. So, by the time you get to the 1750s, two things begin to happen that begin to weave in the minds of the colonists, right? In other words, even in 76, only a few people are thinking in terms of an us, like all of us, like we are a thing, right? We're the colony in Charlestown. We're the colony, in Richmond. We're the people who live in Philadelphia. Do you know that there are people living in New York? Yeah, I think I've heard of New York. I don't know. It might as well be, Luxembourg. It's far away from me. I don't go up there. I never see those people. There's no interchange of information much. Everybody with me? Okay, two things happen. One social, one political. The social one is the Great Awakening. So that's a whole conversation to itself. There's a whole pattern that goes on. We've had several of these, 4 to be technical. Our next one, assuming the pattern holds, will come in the 2050s. But when they happen, there's a lot of religious things that happen, which is not our conversation. But all of them to date have had one non-religious outcome. And for this one, the non-religious outcome is the fact, for the very first time, the colonists, in a very social kind of cultural way, began to understand or perceive that there are other colonists who are here who are like me. That there's more of us like me than there is like those people living in England. They don't know what to call it. They wouldn't use any of the words we would use, but they're sort of like, we got a little something going on with just us. As these preachers would go up and down the 13 colonies doing these revival meetings and these sermons, they would tell stories, and the average listener who's never gone more than 5 miles away from where they live for 45 years hears of places that they recognize are close to them. The second one's geopolitical. One of the reasons why salutary neglect goes on is that from the time of Louis XIV, England and France embarked on what I call the Second 100 Years' War. This blows up through a series of events, starting with Louis, eventually becoming what we call the colonial wars, but the last of which is what we call the French and Indian War. When the French and Indian War exploded, it led to a moment that Ben Franklin took to say, hey, maybe we should spend time together. So how it all happens, the French and Indian War is the only one of all these events that occur first in North America. And it's because the French, the British, the Iroquois Confederation, and the Virginians all thought the Ohio River Valley should be theirs. And so they're out there doing a variety of things, trying to survey it and see where they are. And of course, the British and the French recognize that they're both there, at least a conflict. And eventually, Washington is sent to deliver a message. He's got some Native American allies with him. They deliver the message. The French are like, basically, screw you, we're not leaving. And then as they're going home, they interface with another group of French soldiers under the command of a captain, this guy here, Jumonville, and he's killed. He's attacked by the Native American leader, not in a bad Native American leader. He's the translator for Washington, and he's the one who thinks they might get peace here, and he's thinking, I don't want peace here. I want there to be a conflict because my team, the Native Americans, could benefit if these two kill each other. Right? It's a very long, complex story of who's going to control the land. We see this happening all the time in our own day. Who's in charge of the land? Who was there first? How far back do you want to count? All those kinds of things. And so that leads to the French and Indian War. And for the first time in all these wars that I mentioned, the British will send an army over under Major General Braddock. First time they had done it. The colonists had been begging for troops to come to North America because as good citizens, they had been fighting. They had participated in their various militia groups. And they're like, you guys should send the real army to help us. And so finally they do. Keep that in mind as we go forward. Who asked for the British army to come over? The British citizens living in North America. Not some evil design of London to control people. They're just responding to both the need for the war and the ongoing pleading of their citizens who live in North America. Send us a real army. Everybody with me? It's vital to get this. Okay. So they do. Washington's involved in the very first opening exchanges. Braddock gets killed. Washington kind of gets a claim to fame because he successfully extracts both the body and the rest of the troops out of the disaster Braddock walked them into. The first couple of years are terrible for the British, and then comes William Pitt. And this thing becomes a world war. So again, World War I and II, totally misnamed. The thing we fought 1939 to 45 is probably World War like 8 or 9. Or we've had no world wars, either one, because there was no war happening in Chile and Peru in 1939-45. So either we have had none, or we've had like 9 or 10. Because when we say a world war, we really mean all the big dogs are in on it, and wherever they happen to be. Right? So this thing, they're fighting in India, they're fighting over here in the Dutch East Indies, they're fighting here in Central Europe, they're fighting over here in the Caribbean and South America, and they're fighting up in Canada and in North America. Okay, so this is the moment that Franklin says, here's something I think we should do. So Franklin, who we will do a session on later this year, Franklin he's the grandfather of the fathers, is a way to say it, the fathers of the nation, the parents of the nation. And he is a very progressive, innovative, far-seeing figure in our story. And he's really the first on a political level to say, we could unite. Now, he's not thinking independent nation. What he's really thinking about is what the British will develop middle of the 19th century with the Commonwealth system, where you have places like Canada and Australia and New Zealand and India and South Africa that have their own little parliaments with a prime minister who all answer to the king or to the monarch, right? That's what he's seeing. But he's so far ahead, nobody sees that. They're like, what are you talking about? So they can't see it. And in North America, they don't see it either. As you can see, only a few colonies come to his request for a meeting in Albany. He presents his plan for union. It's rejected. Nobody wants to do all that. Meaning they perceive themselves happily as an independent part of England. Now, South Carolina, we're independent from whatever Pennsylvania wants to do. Whatever Pennsylvania wants to do, you do your thing. We, South Carolina, are on our own. We in Rhode Island are on our own. We do our own thing with the country. All right? Does that make sense for everybody? This is, again, part of that vital aspect of grasp. So it's kind of connected when you put it at the same time as the Great Awakening. Coming into the 1760s, you now begin to have this thought process in more than a few American British citizens that we're not with them. They're like, 2 months sailing away on that island. And so we're our own thing. I'm going to stop for a second. Does everybody have all this? This is important to kind of get this as foundation before we dive in. Okay. Now, the war, eventually there's a lot more here I wish we had time for. William Pitt, perhaps arguably the greatest prime minister, although Winston Churchill fans would argue that, and I'm a Winston Churchill fan, but still William Pitt, he's one of the great ones. Comes to the fore. He's not technically the prime minister, but he's basically the prime minister at this point. runs the battle, hates France, really constructs what will become the British mode of operation all the way through World War II, which is we will have the world's largest navy. We're an island, you can't get to us. We'll have some friends who don't mind spending all their soldiers and individuals fighting on the ground. We'll stay at sea. We will choke you off and starve you to death so that we ultimately win. He puts this in motion. Really, it's the first time it happens. France never saw it coming, and where it had been, if you were kind of watching the game, you're like, oh, France is winning. All of a sudden, it's a steamroll effect, and England begins to destroy them. In fact, you could argue that there are some in the Parliament who could perceive this as a moment that would take France off the board altogether. We could maybe reverse the ending of the First 100 Years' War. And then King George dies. George III comes to the throne. He's young, he's in his 20s. When he comes to the throne, like many new leaders, he wishes to be popular. And we know wars are unpopular, and they're expensive. So he orders Pitt, finish this thing off. We're winning, so France will clearly be willing to negotiate, which they were. And Pitt's like, over my dead body. And so George is like, all right, fine, you're fired. And he brings in some guys who will get this done for him. So the war comes to an end, which is great for France, bad for England, particularly later when you study your American Revolutionary War. Remember, France does not help us because they believe in liberty. Louis XVI is just the latest iteration of absolute monarchy. So they weren't helping us for that. They were helping us because they wanted their land back. And what I mean by that is this, is you see how the war goes from here. There's France's land here, New France, all of this, to this. France is gone. France is not on the continent. So this is 63. So 13 years later, well, 14 years later in 77, when they sign on with us, they're thinking, we can get some of our land back. That's what they're thinking. They're not thinking about liberty in the least. So Pitt was right, George was wrong, but I understand George's point of view in the process. Okay, so if you can then set yourself with this background, right? The list of rights, these two social political things that have begun to weave a little bit in some people's minds about we're a something, and we've had a great victory. Remember, the Second 100 Years' War. From what we could see, if you stop in 63, France will not be a significant player ever again because they were destroyed. And they were beat down and destroyed, right? And so then when you stand there at this point, you kind of go, cool. And so they all lived happily ever after. And of course, that's not what happened. So then we have to say, well what happened? Like, what went wrong? Did anything go wrong? Arguably, nothing went wrong, but you had another situation. So in a summary kind of way, let me give you kind of a summary before we dive back into the details. One is that there's a series of things that go on at this moment that will then ultimately weave the kind of witch's brew that will lead us into this thing called the American Revolution. There's massive debt. There's a challenge of the fact of communication, meaning you are 2 to 4 months between England and North America at that point in technology. That England ends up in a spot with terrible leaders. They go from a great sense of good leadership to all of a sudden 5 prime ministers in 8 years. You've ever followed your sports team and you've gone through 5 head coaches in 8 years, you know your team sucks. Because there's too much instability. Right? Why are the Pittsburgh Steelers always so good? Because they've only like 3 coaches in like 90 years or something. Right? It gives stability. Even if they don't always win the Super Bowl, right? They're kind of always good, the stability factor. Nobody had ever been to the North American of anybody leadership, and there was nobody in charge of the colonies. Which, again, think salutary neglect. Yeah, there's only a few people. Suddenly they realize, no, there's almost 2 million people. What? How did that happen? Nobody had been looking, nobody had been paying attention. They will eventually try to rectify this, but at the moment when they need somebody with a steady hand, there isn't anybody. And they will consistently, all the way through the war, arguably even into the War of 1812, misunderstand the scope of North America compared to their island home, right? They just can't grasp it in that way of looking at it. Of course, the British troops remained here because we just fought a war with the French, who now were gone, and the Indians who were still here, right? And so we kind of want to work that out. And remember who asked for the troops to be there? The British colonists. We did, right? So they're like, okay, we're going to keep it there and protect you in this process. When I say the communication thing, a couple of things to kind of recognize is that the speed of communication in North America will be weeks. And so meaning, as events go, the American point of view, the spin, will take root before the British ever find out it happened. Before they can even respond, and however they wish to respond, there's already a mindset that's taken hold here at home. And one way that I try to help my students understand is that if you could put yourself in a mind thought process, and for them, I'm like, this really was recent in your life. When you're 16, you're functionally an adult. We all know this historically. We've babied our current group, and so we don't even encourage them to get married until 30. But at 16 they could do it. And yet at the same time, they're still under the roof of mom and dad, right? And you may have had this experience, hopefully not, but you may know people who've had this experience. A lot of times there's high tension between an older teenager and parents, depending on how the parents have navigated this and what really they're willing to relinquish control over, right? So that's that kind of whole thing. And so you can often find the two of them arguing their point from a point of view that a neutral learner goes, yeah, I see what you're saying. Oh, but I kind of see what your parents are saying. And working that out is difficult. So in this story, it's as if the American colonists are the teenagers ready to live on their own, and the British government are mom and dad who maybe aren't quite sure, but we're still living under my roof. So, I'm paying for everything. So you still got to do these certain things. And depending on how well you navigate that as a parent, that's a problem. And then you can imagine then either one of those two people, the child, the teenager, or the parent, having their own set of friends that they're telling their side of the story to. And their friends, of course, like, your parents suck. Boy, your kid's a terrible brat, right? And then maybe a neutral observer sees there's a little bit more of a middle ground, right? But that will be a process consistently in what I'm going to show you of the Americans, the British colonists in North America, and the home country talking past each other. And part of what happens when they're talking past each other, because of the bad leadership, which I told you about before, is that they are working with what I call new definitions. So for instance, you probably have thought or been told that at least a part of what the American Revolution is about representation. There's a very famous phrase which we'll come to. It is not about representation at all. But there is a battle about how do we define what is representation. Similarly, you may have been told there's something about economics. There's monopolies, and there's strangleholds, and there's smugglers. Right? Not about economics in the least. But there is a new concept involving economics coming to the fore that eventually we will know as capitalism or free trade. And in 1776, Adam Smith will write the Bible of this. And it'll be not till the early 1800s that everybody goes, oh, I see what the Americans are talking about. Right? So again, this is part of what you have happening between the teenager British citizens in North America and the parent in London as they're talking past each other, because they're working with their own definitions, which are not wrong, but they can't grasp the other person's point of view and their definitions. Okay, there are 5 big moments. These are very famous, you know all these. These are the 5 big moments kind of walk us forward. So let's kind of see if we can kind of get our way moving along. Yeah, we're doing great. So where do we start with? So when war ends in 63, the army's still there. There's a new prime minister. His name is Grenville. So Prime Minister Grenville is responsible for taking care of things. The first thing he wants to do is he wants to try to make sure, let's let things calm down there in North America. So he creates the Proclamation Line of 1763. Maybe a little hard to see, but if you can see the darker areas here, this is the extent of population. Now look where the line is. Can you perceive that the Americans have not even filled in the land that he's allowed for them to have? Right? Can you see that? Meaning if somebody's like, I don't need more land, we'd be like, yes, you have plenty of it right here. Go get it. Feel free. Be fruitful and multiply. right? But it hits the Americans wrongly. Now, Washington correctly notes this is mostly about trying to navigate with the Native Americans. So you can get the sense of where the government's position is kind of like, we're not saying we're not going to move out there ever. We just need to give it a minute. Let the dust settle. Let us negotiate various treaties with the tribes that are there to work our way through. And then once we've done that, you can go. What also Grenville is thinking about is that I don't want to leave troops on the ground here all the time because that's expensive. So let's just maybe, there's nothing written down like this, but it's like I can see Grenville thinking, give me a couple of years. At the end of a couple of years, we're going to pull the troops and send them home. They don't need to stay there, as we will not be at war, theoretically. So this is the idea of what is this process, but it's not what they liked. One reason why is because it seems like it's helping or being a benefit to the enemy. And from the American colonist point of view, having not just fought the French and Indian War, but the other colonial wars against their enemy. I know we would not see it that way necessarily, but again, trying to understand their perspective of those Native Americans, right? Then why would you help them? Don't help them. Take their land, and we're just going to go. We're going to take all their land because that's what we would do. And there's also this idea that at this juncture, the Americans are coming out of our colonial background is this idea of one of the core themes is risk. And the way I express what risk means to the colonists is that we want to go into the frontier. And so we don't want anybody stopping us from going into the frontier. So now again, you're this 16-year-old and you're wanting to go do X. And all of a sudden, from your point of view, out of nowhere, your parents are like, no, you can't do that. And you're like, dude, what? Can you see it? And so the parent's like, I got a reason. I can't even tell you. You may not grasp it. You may not value it. But here's the reason. But nonetheless, they're going to be unhappy, feeling like you've harmed us from going to get the land we fought for. Not just in the French and Indian War, but in the prior wars. And you get this idea, this risk-founding theme. It kind of lays into this concept, which will play into the Americans' view of representation, which is that land is readily available. And while, again, I understand why for many of us there's a problem with that because we know who it's being taken from and we feel the injustice of how that may have been done. At their vantage point, it's land that's empty. Nobody lives on it. We're not going to somebody's teepee and taking that land. We're taking empty land. This is part of the clash of cultures and the differences of how Native American culture valued land and used land civically versus how European culture did so. Not saying one's right or wrong, but they're just different and there's not a way to navigate that. So the Americans perceive themselves as taking empty land. And why did I come over here in 1730 or 1740 or 1760? Because back in Europe, a peasant like me cannot have land. There's no land to have. It's all controlled by these rich, snooty nobles. So I come here and I can have land. And now out of nowhere, you, the government, are telling me I can't go get empty land that was previously controlled by the enemy. You see how the Americans perceive this as a restriction that's unfair and harmful to them, right? Now, the fact that this happens does not cause the revolution to happen, but it's that first moment, in other words, victory, yay, we're all celebrating, and then the next day you kind of go, wait, what? And you're frustrated, right? But that's not really the major thing that's going to drive us forward. The major thing driving us forward is debt. The fact that Britain had been at war for all this time, this is something we all know well. Don't listen to the mythology. We've been at war every day since 1945, which explains why partially explains why we have a massive debt. And I'm pro-military, right? So it's not like I'm anything about that. We've been at war since 45. We've not been at war. They've lied to us because nobody's declared war, but we've had men and women in harm's way since 1945. At war is what we would call that. And it's expensive. Everybody got that? Okay, so this is the picture. So they've been at war for over 100 years. So they're trying to figure out how do we solve this problem. And this is where you kind of get Grenville and the government first kind of illuminating to themselves, wait, there's about 2 million citizens living over here, and they're not paying any taxes. Well, they're paying some. The average British citizen living in North America paid roughly 1/50th, that's the 150, 1/50th of the average taxes. The best way I can explain it is using the illustration. If we found out that folks in Texas or the folks in Illinois today were not paying taxes because a prior citizen of their state became a president, even if you like those two presidents or at least one of them, I would be like, well, that's not cool. Y'all gotta pay your fair share. And why do some of us feel like there are other citizens who still aren't paying their fair share? Right? We have this sense of, hey, everybody chip in. Right? And there's different ways to think about it. And so all of a sudden, salutary neglect shuts off because we sent troops over there to save your butt after you begged us. And we've now defended our land over there. And it turns out there's a bunch of you, we didn't know that, and you're not paying any taxes. You should pay taxes like the rest of us. Not more taxes, just more taxes than you've currently been paying. If you stacked up all the things that the government does between 63 and 75 when they quit, the last one's in 73, but so 10 years, it would not get close to the tax burden of the average citizen in England itself. It's important to realize because, again, the mythology we would have is that somehow they wanted to take all our money, or somehow we were going to pay so many more taxes than anybody else living in the country. No. We just wanted them to pay more than you were paying. Now, to the British point of view, to the American citizen point of view, you get it, right? Do any of you like paying your taxes? Some of you are wealthy, and you could be writing extra checks to the government because we should be out of debt. Here's an extra 1,000. Do any of you do that? No. Why not? In Winter Park, we're a rich, snooty city. You know it. We got the money. Why don't we just pay extra? Because we don't think that's fair. Somebody else should have to pay. Nobody likes paying taxes. So to the British citizens living here in North America, they're like, I don't want to pay more taxes. That's ridiculous. So can you see where the battle's going to come? Right? Okay. So what they do first is they pass what's called the Sugar Act. Now, you'll see these words act, and you'll hear these words tax. Now we're going to come home to modern history, right? They're tariffs. That's all it is. And some of you haven't thought of tariffs since you were in school and you learned about the early 20th century until the past couple of years. You're like, tariff, We've had tariffs all that time. We just don't talk about it. But now you know. I don't have to explain it, right? So that's what we're dealing with. Meaning what? It's not technically a tax. It's just a thing, a bill, an addition added on to something, right? Usually, not in this case, usually it's a nation trying to protect its internal industries. And it does that by picking something that is trying to grow in the internal industries. I'll use cars for instance, although we used to be good with cars, but imagine we were trying to start a car industry, then we would add a tariff to Asian and European car manufacturers. Why? So you, going to the car dealership, would say, oh, here's this American car for $40,000, and here's this European car for $50,000. I don't want to pay $50,000. I don't care how much better it supposedly is. Can you see the simple logic? I know there's more details than that, but can you get it? If we don't have the tariff, maybe the European car's $35,000. So then now you're going to buy the $35,000, right? Okay. So that's what's going on here. We see act, taxes. There's really no taxes as much as there is these duties that are done on top of things. So sugar is the first one. It does include a couple other things such as Madeira wine and coffee. And so this is part of what's going on. But one of the things that then they're battling with right here at the outset is this definition thing around free trade. So at this moment, the kind of going economic theory is a thing called mercantilism. Now it's complicated. I'm not an economist. That's voodoo anyway. Nobody really knows what it means, which is why every president running has like 5 PhDs and they all argue with each other. They don't have 5 different PhDs in science arguing with each other because science is largely agreed upon, largely. In any case, they're going, okay, we're going to do this thing. And what mercantilism meant, simple version, is that wealth is finite. There's only a certain amount in the world, period. and thus the one with the most wealth wins. So when you have wealth to buy something like sugar, you should buy it from us. So the money stays in the family, right? The moment you buy something from France, oh my God, you're a traitor because you have given our finite money away to someone not us. And in France's case, the enemy. Everybody see it? And of course, what the Americans were experiencing before Smith writes about it is capitalism. And in capitalism, wealth is infinite. There's no stopping the amount of wealth that can be created. And a piece of that is through what we call free trade. This is a very simple version, right? Meaning that if someone wants to go get sugar somewhere, they want to put the money out, build a boat, have a crew, pay a salary, take a risk, sail down to an island that's owned by whoever, and get sugar and come back and sell it. That's just business. The British cannot comprehend that. The Americans don't like the fact that they're still working on this other system. So the British are going to accuse people like John Hancock of being smugglers. The Americans are going to look at people like Hancock and say, he's a businessman and you're trying to build a monopoly to squelch business. Talking past each other. Okay? Now, one of the things that I want you to see is this is kind of early in John Adams' influence of the society. He's one of the first to note this. Right? One of the aspects of the Sugar Act was that smuggling would be changed to a felony charge and would move trial to the Vice Admiralty Court, meaning a bunch of British sea captains, admirals, would define things, meaning no jury. And Adams is really one of the first to say, this is a problem. We're not going to go back to the slide, but if you remember on this slide, it was one of the things that had been developed in the British Bill of Rights was trial by jury, which is a huge thing. You can tell how far we've lost value of our own citizenship by however better response they get a jury summons. We won't go further down that road, but it's there. So he notices it. At the same time, they passed a Currency Act. The Currency Act was basically a way to try to ensure the money coming in was not paper, but actual currency that then would be beneficial in the process, right? So it's not really confronting the debt, but it is in a sideways kind of way because it's asking for real specie, right? Gold or silver to kind of pay for things. And you can't just make paper up and say that's wealth, right? And then they also passed the Quartering Act. Now this is very important for you to understand because some of you know the Quartering Act is also held up often in our mythology as an example of the evil British Empire trying to do things to the Americans. I mention this because the response from the Americans to the Quartering Act was silence. Nobody complained about Quartering Acts because everybody was happy to support our troops. We all love supporting our troops. That's a good thing for us to do. It's a very patriotic thing for us to do. The Quartering Act never was British soldiers coming and taking your house. Yes, the occasional officer would go into a house, and when the officer came to your house and said, I'd like to stay at your house, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm selected. This is the most amazing thing ever. By all means, come in, take the master bedroom. Because you had a member, a leading officer of the British military. In general, what it meant for soldiers was you could stay in a barn, there might be some larger group place, an assembly hall, some place that the city had where they could all basically barrack together, barrack down in their tents or just in a barn or something like that. Nobody's taking him his house and nobody's unhappy with it. So they're very happy with this Quartering Act. But then the big drop happens. And that is, because the Sugar Act barely moved the needle, Grenville was still thinking, what's the best strategy here? So in early '65, he gathers his team around him and says, what can we do? And he says, what we want to do is we're going to introduce a more comprehensive tax. Now, the simplest way for me to help people understand what the Stamp Act was like is that it's like our current version of sales tax. You know, you go to Target, you pick up a blouse or a thing, and it says $25. And you walk to the little counter, and when you put it down, can you walk out of there with it for $25? No, you cannot. And which one of you pitches a fit and throws your hands down and raises a patron of, the government sucks, this is terrible, I'm being oppressed? No, because we're all sheep. And you're like, okay, fine, I'll pay the extra $2.13, and you walk out. having dutifully paid your taxes that you've all been trained to pay. Imagine somebody comes with you who's never been in the United States before and never seen sales tax. They'd be mad. Here's my $25. I'm walking out. I'm not cheating you. And you can imagine the poor little target work going, no, it's $27.13. You liars. And you'd be like, here's a $2 and that's good. You're taking your friend out, right? That's what's going on here. The Stamp Act was well known in North America. It was something that, in Britain, it was very comfortable. Everybody kind of knew about it in the process. But it really becomes the defining early moment that the crisis is raising its head about the tension that's going to explode. These differences in definitions. It's the moment when you begin to see that there's going to be two basic strategies. Some of them you might say planned and organized, trying to be fair. Some of them may be a little unorganized or just organic that occurs in the process. But one is there'll be thug gangs that basically go around and attack people. It's basically domestic terrorism. You know these guys, the Sons of Liberty. They're basically our first version of a domestic terrorist group, because what is terrorism? It is using force and fear to accomplish a political aim. That's the whole point. And I know that steps on toes when I said that about the Sons of Liberty. You're happier when I call out the Klan, but which is true, they're also a domestic terrorist group. But the Sons of Liberty were using force and threat. They were committing acts of terror. They're burning people's houses down. They were physically assaulting people. They killed some people. They brutalized other people, the thing called tar and feathering, to get their point across, which is what terrorists do. We don't think we can win in a real battlefield. We don't think we can win in the political arena. We're going to scare all of you to death because most people won't do harm to another, but our crew will. And so then you respond to that because you don't have Spider-Man to save you and you don't know where the police are. And so you just, okay, I'll be quiet right now. And so it's a real, when you really dig into it, it's kind of a chilling thought process and activity that goes along with how people confront differing of political activity. And then, you can navigate how you feel about whether you would do that. At the same time, you have what is more like the middle class, politically minded, lawyerly response of, this feels like one of the rights has been broken, and we should be able to appeal in a legal way to the government, and they will see the logic of our argument and go, oh gosh, we're so sorry. And they will rescind what they did. Throughout the next 13 years, these two trains will be moving together. Again, at times coordinated. There's pretty good evidence, at least in Boston, of how Hancock and Sam Adams used and manipulated the average regular person to go and be violent in the streets for the effect that it would cause. There's other times when I think it's fair to say it is, quite organic in the process. Again, part of the anger is here is because they perceived it as not being direct. This is one of the key things. The Sugar Act would be what they would call a direct tax, meaning if you don't want to pay the tax on sugar, just don't buy any sugar. And you could do that. You could say, I'm not buying sugar. I'll grow my own sugar cane. Or I'll find some other way to sweeten what I want to sweeten without buying sugar. So you have agency in that, an indirect tax. We have direct taxes today. We don't use it very often. It's called a stamp. And you go to some of you still like me write a few letters here and there. And so you pay a tax for the post office to take this to your friend, right? That's what you're doing. You're paying a tax. But if you go, I don't want to do that, you don't. You call them or you use email or something else that you do to send your message, right? Does everybody see that? But sales tax, you can't escape that, right? You can't do it. So that's the idea. But they didn't know what that meant. They didn't like that feeling. Again, it's important. I just want to point this out. This would have only provided 1/5 of what was needed. So again, not an oppressive tax, not over the top, not crazy, but something that the Americans had never seen or experienced before, and they didn't like it. But this, of course, leads to, how they're going to respond. So in Virginia, you get an example of this. A young Thomas Jefferson is watching in the wings as a slightly older, but not all that much older, Patrick Henry leads a very violent and loud charge and ultimately accuses the king of treason himself and threatens the king with a version of execution, to which the Speaker of the House of Burgesses calls him on it and goes, those words, sir, are treason. Henry backs down, but only slightly. In the end, Virginia will pass an opposition to the Stamp Act, but it'll be watered down a little bit because, again, not everybody throughout the colonists is on the side of the revolutionaries. Right, so they're like, I don't think, I like that idea, may not like the tax, but I don't want to go to the idea of threatening the king's personal life, which is what Henry basically does. And so you can kind of see this beginnings argument. It's really shocking, particularly for modern, I find it shocking for moderns. When you read some of the speeches, particularly coming from people in the South, when they're claiming that their liberty is being opposed and the government is trying to enslave them, and you're like, I think if I look around your neighborhood, you guys are already the ones doing the enslaving, but they can't see it. So again, this different idea of definition of liberty, what that actually means. And you heard them, this is the phrase, no taxation without representation. So this begs the question, did Grenville and them act without representation? Well, actually, that's false. They did not act without representation. Grenville specifically asked the colonial representatives what you thought. This is again another great example of how representation is under different types of definition. Ben Franklin is now in London as a representative for Pennsylvania. I think also for Delaware. And so what happens in the fact is that Grenville calls about 6 of them together and says, we've got this debt crisis. Yes, we know. You guys aren't really paying taxes. Yes, we know. So what I thought would be good to do is just what we do here, the stamp tax. It's only, it's pretty broad, but it's not like a sales tax. And so, that'd be a good one to drop in. Franklin, to his credit, said we probably should ask them first. If we ask them and give them agency, that then will give them more buy-in. And Grenville's like, we really don't have time for that, and they don't have that. It's like there's no legal reason to ask them. They're just regular citizens. We didn't ask the people of York if they wanted to do it. We went to Parliament with it. And so there's where you can kind of begin to see the differences. Anyway, Franklin and the rest of the American representatives are like, yep, sounds great. Franklin writes one of his friends. He's like, hey, I got a cushy job for you. Little government job, will not take all of your time, but I need you to take these stamps and you're going to dole them out. You'll get a pretty good little paycheck for this. It'd be great. That guy's house got burned down. Franklin's house almost got burned down, except that his wife gathered some friends in really the nick of time, and literally like on the doorstep. Torches are here. Franklin, down with Franklin. He's a scurvy, jerk, whatever. And they talk him out of it without actually any force that occurs. When Franklin gets word, like a good politician, he completely changes his tune on what he believes, because he's going to do what the people want, so to speak. But it shows how much the distance caused an effect. So he's that far away, he's living in England, he's kind of enculturated to what they do there. He was paying the sales tax, the stamp tax, and didn't have a problem with it, right? And then it shows for how far away that mattered. And then it showed how by being that far away, you didn't know what was on the minds of the people that were actually here. But why it also gives us a real kind of clue about representation is, when the Americans were basically told, you had representation, and they said yes, they're like, wait, he can't represent us. One person can't represent 700,000 of us living in Pennsylvania, right? And if your mind immediately races to our version of how the Senate's structured, you should see now how far we've moved from what our founders believed, right? Because they looked at it, and their idea of representation was that because land was available to nearly everybody, and there was no limitation to who could own land, then many, many, many people could vote, and the governments of all the 13 colonies were structured in a way that each representative had few constituents. And they had a value system at the time that your representative should be, in other words, close to the people, right? And so they're looking, there's no way one guy can represent us. Like, he can't understand what we're all thinking through. Does that make sense for everybody? So in England, few people owned land, so few people voted. They could arguably say, yeah, our representatives also have few constituents, because in a county of, let's say, 50,000 people, there might be 7 voters. William Pitt, the place where he was from, there were 5 voters. They were all part of the Pitt family. So they're like, we have voting, which in France or Germany, they would be like, I wish we had that. But to the Americans who have now, to the British citizens living over here, who now have seen the vast opportunity for everybody to have land who wants it, basically, and then everybody gets to vote. Obviously, ladies, not you, I understand that's frustrating for us, but just in a broad sense of the people in the early mid-18th century, revolutionary, having that many people who could vote. So they're going, we have tons of people voting.
5 people voting for one representative, that's not true government of the people. So you can see again them talking past each other. Well, as word gets to England, they're going to begin to worry, now we've got this kind of explosive action. And so then this will lead to the first gathering nationally of the colonies in what's known as the Stamp Act Congress. In the Stamp Act Congress, they will gather together to determine what do we say back to the Parliament. John Adams, lawyer at this point in Braintree, right outside of Boston, responds and writes the instructions to the Congress that they're going to be basically voting on representation, and those representatives are going to go to meet together in the Stamp Act Congress. And so he writes out, here's what we want you to say to the rest of the group in the Stamp Act Congress. It was seen as so popular that it was basically adopted throughout New England, certainly through most of Massachusetts. And it's arguing this idea that the government is extending its power. It has chosen to pass a tax that we did not vote on through representation, because we didn't vote on it even though Franklin said okay to it. So there wasn't even that piece of it from our point of view. And again, for Adams then, noting the fact that there's an extension of the powers, or we might say a limitation of jury trial. So it's kind of raising that motion. The Congress meets, they make their argument, they kind of push through in their process. They'll meet in October. Only 9 come. They will write the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And I'll come back to this right here. And in the rights and grievances, what they're really arguing is that, look, we're not mad at the monarchy. We're also not saying anything about trying to create a new country. Nobody's mentioning an independence. It's just we feel like this bill that was passed and now this new tax that is upon us is in opposition to the rights we believe we have as British citizens. That's the legal argument that is being made. And you can see it kind of throughout this sense, right? We have all these things we believe we should do, and these are being taken away from us, right? Everybody see where their argument's going. Again, it's why it's important to know the Bill of Rights. Back here, quickly, Franklin is then put on trial, quote unquote, by Parliament. Because Parliament's now going, dude, you said this was cool, and now people are freaking out and burning homes down and, moaning and crying. And so he gets a brand new suit, goes to Parliament. You've all seen the Parliament there in England on TV. He stands right in the middle and answers a barrage of questions. Now, it's important for you to keep in mind at this point that in England, just like everywhere else in the world, right, you have political parties, political groupings, and they hate each other. And more often, it seems like they would prefer that their enemy, the other political party, loses than the country do anything positive. It's more important for them, for the other side to lose, than for the country to move forward. So you got to keep in mind, Grenville's of a political group, and the other political group's like, we got your moment now. You screwed up. Now we can really attack you. So there's a lot, if you go through, you can read this. You can read all, it's very long, but you can read through the whole process. There's a whole series you can see where the political machinations are moving. Franklin's very aware of it, and he plays into it at times. But one of the most telling points about it is two things. One is, are you guys saying you're not happy being British citizens? Are you trying to lead a revolution? Not at all. Every American I know is a proud British citizen, which would have been true still in '65. Secondly, why are they mad about not paying their taxes? He said, well, we're not mad about paying our taxes. We're mad about the type of tax. What are you talking about? This is an indirect tax. It goes everywhere. Right? Does that make sense? Like a sales tax, it's everywhere. We have no problem paying direct taxes. The tax on the sugar. Okay. They file that away. In the end, they will choose to repeal the Stamp Act, but then they will issue what's called the Declaratory Act. It's kind of like the parent saying to the teenager, okay, fine, this time you don't have to come home at midnight like we talked about, but we're still in charge and you're washing the dishes tomorrow. It's that kind of it's a petty little statement, and it was unnecessary, but it kind of sets in motion this pattern that the Americans will learn. If we scream loud enough, we'll get our way, and they'll back down. So this is how you'll end up in the final clash, because they won't actually back down. This is, by the way, the moment for me when you can really, particularly when you look at what happens in the 1790s and the early 1800s, the American Revolution, if you want to sum it up into one word, is here. It's about control. Who is in control? And that's not an evil thing. It's just, that's what it's about. Don't listen to all the other stuff. The Americans are now beginning, particularly guys like Sam Adams and John Hancock, they're saying, We think we should be in control of our own lives and destinies in civic organizations. So they probably would have, at that point, begun to think differently than Franklin. Everybody's a proud British citizen. Sam Adams in particular probably going, I'm not sure I'm going there anymore. He'd be in the single digits, less than 10% if I was guessing, that believed that was the right way to go. So, having heard Franklin, the next government, because Grenville's government falls, you know how the parliamentary system works. If you don't, look it up. But they fall because they can't get this passed. The next government is led by Pitt, but he's old and sick, so he doesn't really govern. His team governs for him. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer is this man here, Charles Townshend. And Townshend was in Parliament when this was going on, and he heard Franklin. And so in essence, he decides to call Franklin's bluff. It's like, all right, fine, you're good with direct taxes, I got you. And so they put a direct tax on basically everything that was imported into England. They're called the Townshend Acts, plural. Not surprisingly, the Americans despise this. And their response, in particular here, is what we call non-importation. It's the decision of we will boycott British goods. Now, it's not universally everybody's doing it, but it's their way to try to bring economics into the story to impact British merchants in the process. You can see also, by the way, there's again a non-jury court that is established in these three cities. And this again plays into this feeling of the government reacting in a way that is against the Bill of Rights. The government would say, of course we have to do this because if you put a smuggler on trial with his buddies, they're all going to get off because the jury will never listen to evidence. They'll just pass somebody off. And so we've got to make sure we protect ourselves in that way and in that regard. So this is really where you get this kind of slow boil beginning to happen that's leading to the explosion. But do notice, we're talking 67 to 70, so 3 solid years of motion without any major crisis. But now, remember what's also happening in the process. Due to the resistance violence, the British government's got to respond to this. Now, you and I today would call 911. Be like, I'm freaking out, people over here, 911, send the police, right? There are no police at this point. There's not really that idea. There were local volunteers who did those kinds of things and, sheriffs and that kind of concept. But there's not like the idea of there's a civic organization called the police. And you're in London, you're the British government, and you got people, good, dutiful citizens, who were attacked, some killed, houses burned down, merchants threatened, merchants' shops destroyed. You can't let that happen. What are you going to do? The only mechanism of force you have at your disposal, happens to be on the frontier. So the troops that were on the frontier to do what? To protect us from the Native Americans are now brought to the cities. Why? Because the Americans are freaking out. But can you see how now this is that tit for tat kind of thing where we're now talking past each other, right? They're not listening to us, we're not listening to them. And so as the troops come into town, you begin to see a growing crisis. In Boston, there were over 10,000 troops. There were 3 British warships in the harbor, which to Bostonians in the ilk of Sam Adams felt like a blockade being imposed on us. The British would have been like, no, it's a port we use. And so we have some ships there. But you can see how the mechanism of how you had things in the news and the promotion of ideas would have gone down. All that leads us to the March 1770 event, in which there's this confrontation with the poor British sentry. You know this. It's called the Boston Massacre. As I've told some of you before, only one of those words is true. And it does happen in Boston. This is a great example of that propaganda, speed of communication thing that I told you about. The story's very famous. We don't need to go into much depth on it, but a British sentry's doing his thing. There had been multiple exchanges like this, where teenage boys, middle-aged boys, grown men, people who had had too much to drink would walk past the officers standing guard where they were supposed to be standing guard, curse at them, spit at them, say ugly things. That's a human nature kind of thing, unfortunately, that can happen. It happens to our officers, our police officers at times today, as I'm sure you're aware. And there have been confrontations. Remember, you have citizens who are still loyal to their government, and they are fed up with this unruly terrorist group that's causing trouble. And there had been fisticuffs and shootings and things that had gone on. And even a few days before this, a 10-year, I think it was 10 or 14, a young boy was killed. He wasn't innocently playing on the playground. He was with the mob throwing rocks. And, wrong place, wrong time, but he was with this mob trying to punish this merchant who was a loyalist. And so, you've got this in Boston with a kid got killed, it's all your all's fault, all that tension leading to this moment. But the thing that's most interesting about this is what we can see about the issue about communication. So this is perhaps one of the most famous drawings by Paul Revere, most famous drawings in perhaps all of human history, perhaps. And it's the showing of the Boston Massacre. Within a week or two, it's all up and down the seaboard, long before London even finds out this has happened. Right? What I love to show people, and it's not unique to me to show people, is how basically false all this is. First of all, notice where the officer is, which is where officers should be when they're telling the troops to fire. But that officer at the time was in the front of his troops. Even the Americans said, yeah, he was in the front. So as John Adams will point out when he's defending these people, clearly he's not going to tell his troops to fire when he's standing in front of them, right? But Revere appropriately puts him back there. Notice that he puts Customs House here as kind of a signal to his viewers that this is all about those dreaded taxes that Townsend had done. And then he sneakily puts a sniper rifle right up here underneath the word Butcher's Hall. So who are the butchers? The British. The British are the butchers. And if you look up here, you may know of the 5 people that were killed. The first one who died was an African-American man named Crispus Attucks. And everybody here is dutifully white so that everybody will feel appropriate, particularly once he gets down south. So Revere creates a propaganda masterpiece. Something happened in Boston. It is very sad that people died, but then again, arguably, you shouldn't have been there in the first place. My parents told me that. Don't be in the wrong place, the wrong time. Then you can have your own view of how that kind of works out there in the process. But this, again, long before England, the government finds out in London that this has gone down and then thinks, what should we do? The mindset and the worldview about the event had already set in motion. It was a massacre. It was a calculated attack on purpose of basically innocent people minding their own business. So that's why then it becomes really interesting when John Adams is asked to defend. Now, one thing to keep in mind at this point, what's going on is the government is playing a dicey game in trying to find out who it can cultivate to its side. So if you think about it, they've got loyalists who are happy in their government. They wanted to be with the government. They were staying here. And then you've got people like Sam Adams, who probably nothing you could do is going to make him happy from your point of view. But you got a bunch of people in the middle, and you want to win them. John and Abigail Adams are people who we could say arguably were in the middle, or they were more moderate revolutionary. They kind of didn't like some of the things like the changes to jury trial, those kinds of things, but they weren't like marching in the street, and they didn't think that was a good idea. And so he had been someone who the government had been asking to take a job, basically, and had turned it down. Like, no, I don't want to do that. But when this comes to him, will you defend Captain Preston, and then later will you defend the army that's there? He's like, yes, I will. And he paid for it with derision. He wasn't attacked because he was Sam's cousin, but still he lost business. He suffered economically for about a solid year for his efforts to do what he would have said is the best thing he possibly could do. And he just basically notes there was a mob, the soldiers were acting, the captain did nothing, somebody shouted fire, and then of course we can't expect trained soldiers to stop and go, wait, why did you shoot your gun? They're going to respond to defending themselves in the action of what they've been trained to do in that moment. And so he gets them off. 2 of them were convicted of manslaughter. Their thumbs are branded with a big M. But in general terms, they're all taken care of. They're off. However, just like with the Stamp Act, Britain will back down again. They will rescind all the Townsend Acts. They'll pull all the troops out of Boston. They'll move them out of Philadelphia. They'll basically get them out of all the cities. And they will back down. But when they rescind the Townsend Acts, they will leave a tax on tea. This is another effort to kind of prove we're still in charge. Now, at this point, the last of those 5 prime ministers comes to office. His name is North. We call him Lord North. And for the next 3 years, there'll be nothing. It's as if North comes in and goes, dude, we need to let the dust settle. So there's going to be nothing. No new taxes. Hasn't solved the debt problem, obviously. But they're like, we are way too close to a precipice we don't want to go over. So we're not going to do anything. This is the last moment when the revolution clearly could have been not happened. If you just go forward from here, the massacre becomes 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. There's that sad, tragic event, but now we just live our lives. Because again, the bulk of the people were in this moderate group with John and Abigail who are like, am I unhappy about a few things? Yeah. Do I want to go out and march in the street? No. Ever see it? And as I was saying at the beginning, what happens then is you get this moment where all of a sudden an unexpected thing happens. And the unexpected thing was that England had its own economic crisis. Its own economic crisis was the 1772 bank failures. So it kind of had an economic crisis that then impacted the East India Tea Company. So nothing to do with the Americans, nothing to do with revolution, none of that. Over in India, the East India Tea Company is in peril. It may be on the verge of collapse. The Parliament, of which many of them, including North, were shareholders in the tea company, they don't want that to happen. And they start thinking, well, what could we do? How could we figure out a way to help the East India Tea Company, right? At this point, go to this little map, you know where India is, of course. But at this point, the rules were very simple. Everything the East India Tea Company was shipping anywhere else to be sold first went to London, England. And then from there, it shipped out wherever it shipped out. And so North and those guys had an obvious denouement, like, wait a minute, we could cut our expenses. Why don't we let them ship directly to our colonies, to Bermuda, to Jamaica, to North America? That's a simple thing at a lower cost. Perfect. Even better, when the tea company's ships got from India to London, they paid a duty. There was a tax, there was an act. So the cost of tea went up. All of it landed, all of it paid a duty. Which is kind of the way it worked. Meaning, when it then went from here to here, because they had what? Kept the tea tax on tea, the price was even a little higher. So North goes, wait a minute, oh, I'm going to be a hero now. This is going to be good. We're going to lower the cost for the East India Tea Company so they can lower the price just generally. And then we're going to eliminate one of the two taxes. So now the overall cost of tea in America will go way down. And it did. It went down almost in half. Best way I can describe it is use, imagine tomorrow the government decided to do something shocking, I know, and gas was slashed in half from whatever it's $4 now north to just $2 tomorrow. Gas everywhere, $2. I'd kiss somebody on the mouth. I'd be so excited. And you get in your car tomorrow morning, you drive, it's Sunday, I know, but you're going to go there. You're going to get you some gas. You're going to get some cans and stuff. And you go to the Wawa, and there's a mob out there. Sticks. Government sucks, Trump's a dictator, this is evil, blah, blah, blah. Oh, I'm going to get in the middle of that. And you drive down to 7-Eleven, it's on fire. And you go to and every place you go, every gas station, there's mobs of people throwing rocks, burning stuff down. How dare they try to rule our lives and get us to buy their gross gas? It's all a conspiracy. Hopefully right now you're going, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. That's precisely what we did. Now, why did we do that? Because Sam Adams and the others recognize if we buy the tea at the lower price, we are agreeing in principle to the idea that they are the ones who passed the laws, which has been the argument all along. What's the American Revolution about? It's about control. Most Americans are like, I'm going to buy me some tea. I know we don't drink tea, most of us. We don't care. Another illustration, imagine tomorrow there was now a $5 tax on everything Coke and Pepsi made. Gatorade, all the waters, all that stuff. All the little cutesy drinks everybody has. $5 tax. A bunch of us would be mad. Right? So that's how much tea was an impact. And so they're like, well, you can't do that. So they're ready to buy the tea. Sam Adams and the others who think like Sam Adams does are like, oh shoot, this is bad. Because 3 years of silence meant 3 years of nobody being mad, nobody asking questions, nobody worrying about it. the support he might have had in 70 after the Boston Massacre dwindling every day. Only the true believers like him still out there pushing the agenda, right? North has no concept he's walking into this. It's not on the agenda. It's not on his plan. He literally was just thinking, we'll make them happy. I'm certain North understood what Sam was saying. Yes, you're going to buy more tea, and that will mean we win, which is the way it should be because we are the government. But we've been winning for the past 3 months because why? You've been paying the tea tax already. 7073's tea tax is not a new tax. It's a reduction in the tax. But we didn't like it because for Sam Adams, we needed to have a problem. So he's not alone. New York, North Carolina, South Carolina. It's a very famous name, so you may know the Pinckney name. Here in North Carolina, it's the women. We're not going to buy the tea. In Philadelphia, Benjamin Rush, who becomes a really important person for us, writes one of his first kind of big writings. It's called On Patriotism. Rush would have been with Sam Adams. He's in that crowd. So he was writing before the Tea Act news came to Philadelphia. Then he adds that in towards the end about the tea and kind of the idea. And you can see him expressing the point, right? If we allow the tea to land and the tax to be paid, then farewell American liberty, right? This idea of us ruling our own lives, control, right? So he sees it. This letter gets passed around. The other Philadelphians produce, 8 resolutions. We're opposed. And this gets up to Boston, and the Bostonians meeting in November, they accept the Philadelphia resolutions. Yes, this is great. We're all in, right? Now remember, if you go across the 13 colonies, you're going to find different amounts of, I've said basically third. It's not really accurate, but you have some who are on fire and then some who are completely on fire for defending their country, and then the middle 50 who most of them are like, oh, whatever, right? So in New York, it would have been maybe 10%, and maybe 30% and 60%. New York was solidly in with their country. But in Boston, it would have been maybe 15% here, and maybe 30% here, and a growing number here, right? Does that make sense for everybody? So it's different in every place. So Sam, Hancock, by this point John, others, they're able to rally in the sense of how dare they pass this thing to us. And they also would have argued that this was in the vein of monopoly. So again, harming people like Hancock, who is, as a businessman. So that's kind of what's playing in their minds also. And you can see first 3,000 citizens and then even more on December 16th. They're going, they're charging. The Quincy family is one of the big families that many people don't know about relative to the Revolution, but they're one of the major families there along with the Hancocks and the Adamses. And so, he has a speech at that meeting, and then over 2,000 of them go, let's go! Hutchinson the governor can't do anything because where are the troops? They've all been pulled out. So they all march down, get on the Dartmouth, throw the tea overboard, ta-da, Boston Tea Party, okay? Now, it's not just there that it happens, by the way. All this gets across to all the different ports. Everybody hears about it. So in Philadelphia, it's the Polly. The Polly does not have its tea dumped because the captain goes ashore, basically gets kidnapped by the Committee on Tarring and Feathering. Yeah, America, right? There's one of our groups there. And so he's basically held captive, threatened, and he's like, okay, look, I'll leave. So he does. Later you can see Charlestown. There the tea is seized, not sold, at least not till later. New York, kept through ships. Maryland, that's later, obviously April and May, it's after this, but there they do dump the tea in Maryland. So it's not just Boston, where you've got that crowd that's moving. This is the moment where really the revolution is now on. It's here that you say, this is it. And it's precisely what Adams needed. Because what we had? 3 years of silence. Because the government can't let this lie. Now, for many of us, we're like, is this a little tea? John Adams claimed it was 7 years worth. It was several tons. And then we're kind of like, tea? Really? Like, there's no reason to get that mad. Again, it's more important than that. But remind yourself of perhaps the the Robin Hood story, why does Robin Hood even have to be there? Because the poor peasants are under assault by the evil sheriff. Why? Because they're hunting where? In the king's forest. So when you shoot the quail or the deer, you have stolen from the king. Now, because we don't have kings, thankfully, you don't understand that process, but it's the idea of you attacked the king's person by assaulting and destroying all that tea. You at least need to pay it back, but you need a big time apology. And quite honestly, we need somebody's head for this. You can't attack the king. That's the extent of it. We wouldn't see it that way if some company, we've had companies get attacked at different times because of people not liking their labor practices or things with the environment. None of us think that was an assault on the president. Right? We don't think like that, but they did. And you got to get that in your head to understand where they're coming from. So Britain's like, we have to do something. And what they produced was a very moderate, limited, and narrow set of things called the coercive acts. They were to coerce the Bostonians to their error, and they needed to respond. We don't call it that. What do we call it? Intolerable. How dare they? Again, cross purposes talking. Notice again where it's aimed, and notice again how this betrays. Look where it's aimed, right? Oh, sorry, here we go, this guy. But then look at the guy. You and I know this. They don't know this. They think this is in Boston. You and I are like, it may only be 30% boys, but it's up and down the seaboard. It's the whole 13 colonies. So again, not having somebody from here, not having a committee member or a cabinet member responsible, not having come and visited to try to see what's going on. They never seen anybody. You thought somewhere along the way they would have said, let's send like some emissaries over there and spend a couple years and figure out what's up with these people. Never happened, right? And so when you get to the coercive acts, there's this sense in which they're trying to figure out a way to be moderate in their response, but they're blind to the fact that it's the 13 colonies now that are outraged. And with this list, even though from a neutral point of view, it's, yeah, I get it, I see what you're doing there, to a crowd of people, think about that middle group, the moderate, revolutionaries, the moderate rebels, how they would proceed. Up to this point, all these things have been done to do what? To take our liberties from us. Well, this is just the last straw, right? And so it is known as intolerable acts. It is the place in which, they kind of step over the line. And this is, where you have a bunch of other issues that play into. I think we're going to call it right here. From here, let me go back to this one slide to show you this. Thomas Gage becomes the guy in charge. He's actually a pro-American. His wife's American. He lived here after the French Indian War, liked it, was going to just live his whole life here. And he's really the first of the British leaders who kind of gets his fingers on the pulse. He goes, okay. And he writes a letter to London, and he basically says, look, you got two choices. You either back off and just let them do their thing, or you need to send me an army of 50,000 troops. British Army had never put together an army of 50,000 troops ever in their history. They didn't have 50,000 troops. It'd be like back in the Iraq situation or Afghanistan, our leading generals had said, we can solve all these problems we're having, just send me 5 million American soldiers. You and I would go, we don't have 5 million American soldiers. Could we get 5 million? Sure. Do we want to go through the turmoil of what a draft would be like for an unpopular experience in Iraq and Afghanistan? I say no. So you can see how Gage's response played out in England. They're like, you crazy? He sent like 5,000 or 7,000 more troops and 3 generals. So now you have 4 generals, and if you get 4 generals in a room, you know what that's like. Right? So again, poor leadership, bad decision making on the part of the British. Gage will do his very best to try to solve the problem in lots of ways. One of those is I need to figure out a way to make sure that these people who are already hot and bothered, and to some degree you can hear Gage going, which I understand, can't harm anybody else. And so we need to get any stores of weaponry that they have. We're all happy British citizens. You don't need your own stockpile of weapons and stuff. And that's what ultimately leads to the showdown in what we know as like the Continental Concord, which of course Professor Solomon covered in January when we looked at So now, at this point, the First Continental Congress happens. Lexington and Concord's coming. First Continental Congress is going to once again write one more document and say, hey, Bill of Rights, we're just trying to argue from this. They'll even write a kiss-up letter to the king. But by this point, George who's really not been involved, not like in a bad way of abdicating, but in an appropriate way of working the British governmental system, which is king in Parliament. So he's bound by what the Parliament wants to do. He now is drawing a hard line. These people have attacked me. We can't let this stand. And so their overtures in 74 and 75 fall on deaf ears. And he just won't receive it because he wants them to apologize. And again, think about the metaphors I've given you. There's no way they're going to apologize because from their point of view, they've run into this place based on a series of events. So has England. And so when Lexington and Concord happen, it's not really what starts it. I would suggest it's the Boston Tea Party and then the response and the failures of understanding that both sides do, that then there's no coming back at that moment. No matter what the two Continental Congresses try to do, and they do try to write things to England and say, hey, not we're sorry, but hey, there's a way out. There really wasn't at that point a way out. And we'll keep digging into that as we go through the rest of this year. And that's a good place for me to stop right there. So thank you so much.